Welcome, dear readers, to a journey through time and the human heart. Today I share with you a story that transcends eras, a narrative about courage, compassion, and the transformative power of love in adverse times. Between the dust of territorial Arizona and the winds of change, we will discover how a brave widow and a lost child found in each other the strength to challenge prejudices and build bridges between seemingly irreconcilable worlds. Where are you watching from? Leave us your city in the comments. Your presence here enriches our community of lovers of good literature. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe for more exciting narratives. Arizona Territory, year 1873, near the town of Mesilla. The widow and the Apache girl. The August sun punished the parched earth with the cruelty of 4 consecutive years of drought. Catherine Morales, known to all as Kate, watched through the fogged window of her kitchen the once verdant fields that now stretched like a sea of dust and dry thorns. At 28, she carried in her green eyes the melancholy of one who had been widowed too young, and in her calloused hands the determination of her Irish heritage mixed with Mexican blood. The farm that had once flourished under the care of Eduardo, her husband, now whispered memories through the creaking boards of the porch and the silent corridors. 5 months had passed since typhus took Eduardo one April morning, when the last wildflowers still bravely resisted the approach of the relentless summer. Kate adjusted the lace shawl that had been her mother's, a delicate fabric that contrasted with the rusticity of her current life. The aroma of freshly made tortillas still floated through the kitchen, mixing with the smell of old wood and the subtle fragrance of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. It was a routine she maintained not from hunger, for she ate little these days, but from the need to keep her hands busy and her heart away from melancholy. Outside, a hot wind raised small whirlwinds of earth, dancing between the cacti and the remains of what had once been a rose garden. Kate closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember Eduardo's voice humming Mexican songs while tending the plants. His deep, melodious voice still echoed in every corner of the property, as if the very walls kept the echo of his joy. Rumors came from Mesilla about the discovery of silver in the nearby mountains. Men with greedy eyes appeared in the town almost daily, with their picks and dreams of easy wealth. Sheriff Thomas Briggs seemed particularly interested in these developments, his small eyes gleaming with an ambition that Kate considered dangerous. But what disturbed her most were the stories about conflicts with the local Apaches. There was talk of a chief called Shadow Wolf, who supposedly roamed the region searching for something or someone lost. Kate, daughter of a dreaming Irishman and a brave Mexican woman, understood better than her neighbors what it meant to be seen as a foreigner in one's own land. As twilight painted the sky in shades of copper and violet, Kate lit the kitchen lamp and sat at the table where she had so often shared meals with Eduardo. The silence was so dense she could almost touch it, broken only by the occasional crack of cooling wood and the distant howl of wind among the rocky hills. A strange sensation invaded her, as if the very air was charged with expectation, as if fate was preparing some radical change in her life ordered by the routine of widowhood. Kate did not yet know that, in the distant mountains, a storm was forming, and that this storm would bring with it much more than rain and wind. Something was about to arrive that would forever change the solitary echo of her days. The sandstorm arrived like a hungry beast the following morning, swallowing the horizon in a thick curtain of dust and fury. Kate had seen many storms in her years in the Arizona Territory, but this one carried something different, a wild energy that made the horses neigh nervously in the stable and the property's dogs hide under the porch. The wind howled like ancestral voices, carrying with it the acrid aroma of parched earth and something more, a metallic smell that foreboded changes. Kate closed all the windows and doors, but the dust still found its way inside the house, settling like a layer of golden memories on the dark furniture. It was during a brief calm in mid-afternoon that she heard the weak moan coming from the backyard. Initially, she thought it was the wind playing with the loose fence boards, but there was something too human in that sound to be ignored. With her shawl firmly wrapped around her shoulders, Kate carefully opened the back door. There, among the sage bushes that her mother-in-law had planted years before, was a child, small, covered in dust and dried blood, with long black hair tangled by wind and flight. It was an Apache girl, Kate realized immediately, about 8 years old, her dark eyes still half closed from exhaustion and pain. Kate's heart raced not with fear, but with a maternal compassion she hadn't felt in a long time. The child was conscious, watching her with a mixture of distrust and silent desperation, There were deep scratches on her small arms and a cut on her forehead that had bled, but was now dry and stuck with dirt. "Little one," Kate whispered in Spanish, the language she had learned from her mother and that Eduardo had refined with his loving patience. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child blinked, and Kate perceived a flash of understanding in her eyes. Slowly, like one approaching a wounded animal, Kate extended her empty hands, palms up, in a universal gesture of peace. "Water?" the child said with a hoarse voice, and Kate felt a wave of relief realizing they could communicate at least minimally. "Yes, water," Kate responded, rising slowly. "Stay here." She returned quickly with a glass of fresh water and a damp cloth. The child drank eagerly, as if she hadn't tasted water in days. Meanwhile, Kate observed the child's delicate face, noticing the high cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes that reflected an ancient, premature intelligence. "What's your name?" Kate asked gently, while carefully cleaning the cut on the girl's forehead. "Ayana," the child responded, and then, as if testing trust, added, "Flower." Kate smiled for the first time in weeks. The name was perfect, Ayana, eternal flower in Apache, and the child had translated so she would understand. "I'm Kate," she said, pointing to herself. "House. Safe." Ayana nodded, and Kate perceived that despite her young age, the girl possessed remarkable composure. She didn't cry, didn't beg. She just observed and evaluated, as if she had learned too early that survival depended on correctly reading people's intentions. When Kate helped her enter the house, she noticed that the girl limped slightly from her left leg. The warm kitchen must have seemed like paradise after the storm outside. Kate prepared a warm bath and found one of her oldest nightgowns to serve as clothing for Ayana. While the child recovered in the tin bathtub, Kate prepared a simple soup of beans with pieces of dried meat. The comforting aroma of home cooking filled the kitchen, creating an atmosphere of welcome that contrasted dramatically with the violence of the storm still raging outside. But Kate knew that the real storm was just beginning. Somewhere in the mountains, someone was probably looking for this child, and when they found her, Kate would have to make a decision that would change her life forever. For now, however, there was only a lonely woman and a lost child, sharing the warmth of a home and the universal language of human compassion. The 3 days that followed passed in a delicate and comforting routine. Ayana recovered quickly, her youth working in favor of healing. Kate discovered that the girl knew more Spanish than she had initially shown, words learned through contact with Mexican traders and prisoners who occasionally crossed Apache territory. "Mama, dead," Ayana said one morning, pointing toward the distant mountains, while Kate gently combed her long black hair. "Soldiers, horses." Kate felt a tightness in her chest as she understood. The child had lost her mother in a military attack, probably during one of the incursions that the American army regularly made against Apache camps. The solidarity between women who had lost loved ones created a silent bond between them. "My husband too," Kate murmured, delicately touching the wedding ring she still wore. "He's also dead." Ayana nodded, with a wisdom that broke the heart. At 8 years old, she already understood the universal language of loss and longing. Ayana's leg was improving, but Kate knew she needed proper medical care to ensure there was no infection. Dr. William Hayes, the only doctor in Mesilla, was a pragmatic man who treated both Mexicans and Americans as long as they could pay for his services. On Thursday morning, Kate prepared the wagon. She dressed Ayana in one of her simplest dresses and covered the girl's hair with a scarf, hoping they could pass unnoticed in the town. It was a naive hope. Mesilla seethed with the excitement of the possible silver discovery. Hard-faced men occupied the porches of Samuel Porter's tavern, discussing mining rights and territories. American women gathered in groups near Mrs. Ruth Baldwin's store, their low voices carrying the weight of gossip and concerns. When Kate got down from the wagon with Ayana beside her, an uncomfortable silence spread down the main street like an oil stain. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the mayor's wife and a woman of English origin, who never missed an opportunity to demonstrate her cultural superiority, was the first to approach. "Kate Morales," she said, with a voice that cut like ice. "What does this mean?" "The child was injured," Kate replied calmly, passing her protective arm around Ayana's shoulders. "She needs medical care." "She's an Apache," said Samuel Porter, coming out of the tavern with several other men. "Probably a spy. She shouldn't be here." The tension in the air was palpable. Kate felt Ayana shrink slightly beside her, but the girl kept her head high, facing the hostile stares with a dignity that impressed all present. "She's a child," Kate said firmly. wounded and alone. It was then that Don Carlos Rivera approached. The elderly Mexican rancher, whose lands lay on the other side of Mesilla, had known Eduardo and respected Kate for her strength during the mourning period. "Mrs. Morales does what is right," he said in accented but clear English. "Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me.'" Mrs. Baldwin snorted indignantly. "Don Carlos, that child is savage. She could bring trouble to our community." "What trouble can an 8-year-old girl bring?" Kate replied, her Irish heritage surfacing in the defiant tone of her voice. Dr. Hayes appeared in the doorway of his clinic, attracted by the commotion. He was a tall man with a grey beard who had seen many things in his years in the territory. "What is the medical problem?" he asked pragmatically. "The girl's leg was injured," Kate explained. "I want to make sure there's no infection." Hayes looked at Ayana, then at the group of people around, and finally at Kate. "Bring her inside." The examination was quick but careful. Hayes cleaned the remaining wounds and applied an ointment to some scratches that still hadn't completely healed. "She'll heal well," he told Kate. "Continue cleaning the wounds with warm water and salt." When they left the clinic, the group was still there. Mrs. Thornton stepped forward. "Kate, you can't keep this child. It's not safe for any of us." "My house, my decision," Kate replied calmly, helping Ayana climb into the wagon. As they drove away from Mesilla, Kate noticed Ayana carefully observing each face, each gesture, as if she were memorizing potential enemies. The girl was learning that, even amid compassion, the world was full of people who saw in her only a threat. But there was also Don Carlos, who had positioned himself on the side of justice, and Dr. Hayes, who had seen in her only a child needing care. Perhaps there was hope after all, even in times of such fear and prejudice. The news arrived in Mesilla 3 days later, brought by a group of Mexican traders coming from the south. Kate was in Mrs. Baldwin's store buying supplies when she heard the name for the first time, Victorio, known to Americans as Shadow Wolf. "They say he's looking for something," one of the traders murmured to Don Carlos in Spanish, not knowing that Kate understood every word. "Or someone." His warriors were seen in the nearby mountains following tracks. Kate felt her blood freeze in her veins. Mrs. Baldwin, who had caught only fragments of the conversation, approached nervously. "What are they talking about?" she asked, her voice sharp with anxiety. Don Carlos hesitated, looking meaningfully at Kate before responding. "Apache movement in the mountains, nothing more." But Kate knew it was much more than that. That afternoon, while Ayana slept in her improvised room in the living room, Kate sat on the porch watching the distant mountains. The girl had shown deep sadness when looking in that direction, as if she felt the presence of something or someone familiar. "Papa," Ayana had whispered that same day, pointing toward the mountains while helping Kate hang clothes on the line. "Wolf searches." Now Kate understood. Victorio wasn't simply roaming the territory. He was searching for his lost daughter. The girl sleeping under her roof was the daughter of the feared Apache chief, whom the newspapers described as a violent phantom of the mountains. During the following days, more details came through the traders and travelers who stopped in Mesilla. Victorio was recognized even among his enemies as a brilliant military leader and devoted father. He had lost his wife in a military attack 3 months before, and since then had been searching for his only daughter, who had disappeared during the chaos of battle. "They say he offered horses and silver for information about her," Don Carlos told Kate during a discreet visit to her farm. "He's not a man who gives up easily." Kate watched Ayana play in the yard with a rag doll she had improvised with old scraps. The girl had blossomed in recent days, laughing more, eating better, even trying some words in English. She seemed like a normal child who played and ran around the yard like any other. "If he finds her," Kate began. "He'll take her away," Don Carlos gently completed. "It's what any father would do." That night, Kate lay down, unable to sleep. From the next room came Ayana's soft and regular breathing, a sound that had become comforting in her silent house. In just 1 week, the girl's presence had transformed the farm from a mausoleum of memories into something that approached being a home again. But Kate knew she couldn't keep Ayana away from her father forever. It would be cruel and unjust. Victorio had the right to know that his daughter was alive and safe. Ayana had the right to return to her people, to her culture, to the arms of one who had loved her since birth. And yet, the idea of separating from the girl created a painful emptiness in her chest. After months of solitary mourning, Ayana had brought back to her life something that Kate thought she had lost forever. A purpose, a reason to smile, the simple joy of caring for someone. In the silence of dawn, Kate made a decision. She couldn't deprive Victorio of knowledge about his daughter, but she also couldn't simply let him take Ayana without ensuring that the girl was safe and happy. Somehow she needed to find a way to make contact with the Shadow Wolf, a task that might cost her not only peace, but possibly her own life. The encounter happened on a September morning, when the first autumn clouds were beginning to form over the distant mountains. Kate was in the yard hanging clothes when Ayana, who was playing nearby, suddenly stopped and raised her head like an alert animal. "Papa," the girl whispered, her dark eyes shining with an emotion Kate had never seen before. It was then that Kate saw them. First, they were only shadows moving among the distant rocks. Then, gradually, they became human figures, 5 Apache warriors on horseback, silently descending the rocky slope toward the farm. Kate's heart accelerated, but not with fear. It was something more complex, a mixture of anxiety, expectation, and a strange sensation of inevitability. This moment had been approaching since the day she found Ayana, and she knew it. Ayana ran into the house, but not to hide. Kate heard drawers being opened and realized the girl was getting the colored bead necklace she kept carefully, a gift from her mother that she had managed to keep with her throughout the ordeal. When she returned to the yard, the riders had stopped about 50 meters from the house. One of them stood out from the rest. He was taller, with broad shoulders and a presence that naturally commanded respect. His black hair was braided with small feathers and leather strips, and his eyes, the same almond-shaped eyes as Ayana's, examined the property with sharp intelligence. Victorio, the Shadow Wolf. Kate left the porch and walked slowly toward them, keeping her hands visible and her movements deliberately calm. Ayana followed her, her small steps becoming faster with each meter until she was almost running. "Papa!" she cried in Apache, and Kate didn't need to understand the words to comprehend the pure joy in the girl's voice. Victorio dismounted from his horse with fluid grace that spoke of years of life in the saddle. His eyes never stopped watching Kate, evaluating, measuring her intentions. But when Ayana ran to his arms, his expression transformed completely. The reunion between father and daughter was something Kate would keep in memory forever. Victorio knelt and wrapped Ayana in his arms, whispering words in Apache, while the child cried for the first time since Kate had known her. They were tears of relief, of joy, of a love that had survived separation and fear. After a few moments, Victorio stood up, keeping one hand on his daughter's shoulder, and walked toward Kate. He stopped 3 steps away, close enough to converse, far enough not to seem threatening. "You cared for her," he said in hesitant but understandable Spanish. Kate nodded. She was hurt, lost. Victorio looked at the clothes Ayana wore, a simple but clean dress that Kate had adjusted for her, and then observed the girl's healthy and rosy face. "Thank you," he said, and the word carried the weight of gratitude that transcended languages. It was then that Kate heard the sound of horses rapidly approaching the property. Her blood froze, recognizing Sheriff Briggs's voice shouting orders to his men. They had arrived with 12 armed men, probably expecting to find a very different situation. Victorio heard too and immediately positioned himself between the approaching riders and his daughter. His warriors, who had remained mounted and alert, prepared their bows and spears. Kate realized she was at the epicenter of a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. 12 armed men from the sheriff against 5 Apache warriors, with a child and a woman in the middle of the conflict. "Wait!" Kate shouted, placing herself between the 2 groups. "Stop!" Briggs arrived with his men, raising a cloud of dust. When he saw the Apaches, his hand went instinctively to his weapon. "Kate Morales," he said with a tense voice, "get away from those savages." "They are her father and family," Kate responded firmly. "They came to get their daughter." "That child is property of the American government now," Briggs said, his political ambition clearly speaking louder than any sense of humanity. "She must go to a missionary school." It was then that Ayana did something that surprised everyone. She freed herself from her father's hand and walked to Kate, taking her hand and then extending the other toward Victorio. "Family," she said clearly, looking at Briggs. "Both of them." In that simple but powerful moment, the girl had declared her loyalty to both Kate and her father. She had found a way to honor both worlds that were now part of her life. The tension in the air was almost solid, but something in the purity of the child's gesture made even some of Briggs's men slightly lower their weapons. The fate of all of them now depended on what would happen in the next few minutes. What followed was not exactly peace but a tense truce mediated by Ayana's innocent presence. Briggs, realizing that a battle there would probably result in his own death and that of his men, decided to retreat, but not without first making veiled threats about collaboration with hostiles. In the days that followed, an extraordinary routine was established. Victorio and two of his warriors camped in the hills near Kate's farm, while Ayana divided her time between two worlds. During the day she stayed with Kate, helping with household chores and continuing to learn English and Spanish. At dusk, she went to the Apache camp, where her father taught her the traditions of her people. Kate observed this delicate dance between cultures with growing fascination. Victorio, far from the savage that newspapers described, revealed himself as a man of remarkable intelligence and natural dignity. He knew more Spanish than he had initially shown, and even some words in English, learned during previous negotiations with the American army. "Strong woman," he told Kate one afternoon, while they watched Ayana play with an Apache doll he had brought for her, an intricate creation of leather and beads that contrasted beautifully with the rag doll Kate had made. "Wise man," Kate responded, and saw a flash of something that could have been amusement in his dark eyes. But the relative tranquility was interrupted by the arrival of more miners to the region. The silver discovery had been confirmed, and Massilia seethed with men of greedy gaze and little appreciation for anything that wasn't precious mineral. Samuel Porter expanded his tavern, Mrs. Baldwin was ordering more expensive merchandise to serve the new customers, and even Mrs. Thornton seemed to have momentarily forgotten her concerns about savages in favor of the profits that miners brought. The problem was that the mines were located exactly in the mountains sacred to Victorio's people, places where their ancestors were buried, where they performed important ceremonies, where the medicinal plants they needed grew naturally. "They don't understand," Victorio explained to Kate one of those afternoons, his voice laden with deep sadness. "For them, mountain is, how do you say thing? For us, mountain is dead family, spirits, life." Kate understood better than he imagined. Her Mexican mother had taught her about sacred places, about spiritual connection with the earth, and her Irish heritage had made her grow up hearing stories about hills where ancestors danced and rivers that had souls. It was during one of these conversations that Kate had a bold idea. If she could convince some of the miners that there was more to gain with peace than with conflict, perhaps she could mediate an agreement. There were men among the miners who respected strength of character when they saw it, and Kate had shown courage by protecting Ayana. "We can talk to them," she suggested. "Explain, find places to mine that aren't sacred." Victorio observed her with an intensity that made her blush slightly. "You would risk for our people?" "I would risk for peace," Kate responded simply. "And for Ayana." In that moment, something changed between them. It wasn't just mutual tolerance or respect anymore. There was a deeper connection forming, based on shared values and genuine care for the welfare of the girl they both loved. Ayana, watching the two adults converse with growing closeness, smiled with the premature wisdom of a child who had learned early to read the emotions of people around her. "Kate and Papa," she said in Spanish, "good friends." But Kate knew that what was growing between her and Victorio was something more complex and dangerous than friendship. It was an attraction that challenged all social conventions of her time, and that could put them in even greater danger than they already were. Still, when Victorio looked at her with those eyes that reflected the same intensity of the mountains at sunset, Kate felt something in her heart that she had long thought was dead along with Eduardo. Silver fever was changing the entire region, but the real transformation was happening in the heart of a widow who was discovering she was capable of loving again. Military intervention arrived on a cold December morning, when the first frosts of winter had painted white the leaves of the cacti. Captain James Wheeler was a tall and austere man, with cold blue eyes and a posture that spoke of years following regulations to the letter. He arrived with 20 soldiers and a specific order: investigate reports of collaboration between civilians and hostiles. Kate was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she heard the clatter of horses. Ayana, who had developed a sharp instinct for danger, appeared silently by her side. "Soldiers," the girl whispered. "Go to your father," Kate said gently. Now, but it was too late. Wheeler had already surrounded the property, and there was no way for Ayana to reach the camp in the hills without being seen. Kate opened the front door with all the dignity she could muster. Wheeler dismounted and approached with measured steps. "Mrs. Morales," he said, lightly touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Captain Wheeler. I have some questions to ask." "Captain?" Kate responded, keeping her voice firm. "How can I help you?" There are reports that you are harboring an Apache child, Wheeler said, going straight to the point, and that you maintain regular contact with hostiles in the region. Kate felt Ayanna hide behind her skirt. The girl had learned to associate military uniforms with death and separation. I found an injured child, Kate said calmly. I cared for her wounds. When her father found her, I facilitated the reunion. I see no crime in that. Wheeler looked around the property with eyes that catalogued every detail. The crime, madam, is giving aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States. It was at this moment that Father Samuel Matthews arrived. The Methodist minister had come to make his monthly visit to the farm, but now his presence took on much greater importance. Captain Wheeler, said Father Matthews, getting down from his carriage with the moral authority that his position conferred upon him. What brings the army to these peaceful lands? Father, Wheeler responded, clearly uncomfortable with the religious man's presence. Military matters. Matters involving an exemplary woman and an innocent child, it would seem, said Matthews, observing Ayanna hiding behind Kate. The Bible teaches us, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Wheeler was clearly irritated by the religious intervention. Father, with all respect, there are national security issues at stake here. And there are issues of Christian humanity as well, Matthews replied firmly. Mrs. Morales acted out of compassion, not sedition. While the two men debated, Kate noticed movement in the hills. Victorio and his warriors had positioned themselves strategically, ready to intervene if necessary. Their presence wasn't visible to the soldiers, but Kate knew they were there. Where is the Apache chief now? Wheeler asked, turning his attention back to Kate. I don't know, she replied honestly, and she didn't know exactly where Victorio was at that specific moment. Wheeler studied her face, looking for signs of lying. Mrs. Morales, do you understand the consequences of protecting enemies of the Union? I understand the consequences of abandoning an injured child, Kate responded with courage that surprised her. And I couldn't live with myself if I had done otherwise. Father Matthews approached Wheeler. Captain, may I speak with you privately? The two men moved a few steps away. Kate couldn't hear their words, but she saw the body language. Matthews speaking with controlled passion, Wheeler responding with military rigidity, but gradually seeming less certain of his position. Finally, they returned. Wheeler looked at Kate with something that might have been reluctant respect. Mrs. Morales, he said, on Father Matthews's recommendation, and considering that you are a war widow and respected citizen, I will report that I found only a charitable woman caring for an injured child. Kate felt relief flood her chest, but Wheeler wasn't finished. However, he continued, any future contact with hostiles must be reported to military authorities. Is that clear? Perfectly, Kate replied. When the soldiers left, Father Matthews remained. He looked at Ayanna with paternal gentleness, and then at Kate. You know this isn't over, he said softly. There will be more pressure. They want all Apaches removed to distant reservations. Kate nodded, understanding that the battle for the family she had found was just beginning, but for now they had survived another test, and little Ayanna was still safe under her roof. The solution came through an unexpected source. Major Robert Coleman, a career officer who had served in the Indian Wars for more than a decade and understood better than his subordinates the complexity of relations between cultures. He arrived at Kate's farm on a January afternoon alone, without the military spectacle that had marked the previous visit. Coleman was a middle-aged man with grey hair and eyes that had seen many things. Unlike Wheeler, he didn't come to impose authority but to seek understanding. Mrs. Morales, he said, accepting the coffee Kate offered, I have a proposal that can benefit everyone involved. Ayanna was at the improvised school that Father Matthews had established for the region's children, a decision that Kate and Victorio had made together, recognizing that the girl needed to understand both worlds in which she lived. I'm listening, Kate said, also serving coffee to Victorio, who had been invited to the meeting. Coleman addressed Victorio directly. Chief, the American government is willing to negotiate. We want peace as much as you do. Victorio observed him with justified skepticism. American soldiers don't want peace, they want land, they want gold. Some soldiers, yes, Coleman admitted honestly, but some of us want justice. And there's a way to achieve that. The proposal was complex but hopeful. Instead of forcing all Apaches to distant reservations like Bosque Redondo, the government was willing to establish a small local reservation in the mountains less valuable for mining, where Victorio's people could maintain their traditions while gradually adapting to the growing American presence. And my daughter, Victorio asked. Your daughter stays with you, Coleman said. But she must also learn English, attend school. The future will require that she knows how to navigate both worlds. Kate realized that this was exactly the life Ayanna was living, divided between Apache traditions with her father and American-Mexican education with her. It was a delicate balance, but it worked. There are conditions, Coleman continued. No attacks on miners or settlers. Trade must be conducted through official channels. And, he looked at Kate, the community must accept this Apache presence. This last point was the most difficult. Resistance in Mesilla was still strong, especially among families like the Thorntons, who saw any concession to Apaches as a sign of weakness. It was then that Kate had one of her boldest ideas. What if the Apaches could help with mining? Both Coleman and Victorio looked at her surprised. Explain, Coleman said. Victorio's people have known these mountains for generations, Kate said, gesturing toward the distant peaks. They know where it's safe to dig, where there's water, which areas are unstable. The miners are working blindly, causing cave-ins, wasting time in the wrong places. Victorio began to understand. Our knowledge for money. Exactly, Kate said. A partnership. Apaches provide local knowledge, ensure sacred places are respected. In return, they receive a percentage of the profits. Coleman was silent for a long moment. It was a radical idea for the time, a true partnership between Americans and Apaches based on mutual benefit instead of subjugation. It would be necessary to convince many people, he finally said. Miners, civil authorities, your own warriors. It would be necessary, Kate agreed, but the alternative is continuous war. Nobody prospers with war. When Coleman left, he left behind a preliminary document outlining the proposal. It wasn't an agreement yet, but it was a beginning. That night, while Victorio returned to camp and Ayanna slept peacefully in her room, Kate sat on the porch watching the stars. She had proposed something that would completely change the region's dynamics. If it worked, it could be a model for peaceful coexistence. If it failed, it could result in more hostility and violence. But looking toward the house where an Apache girl slept safely, after a day of learning both English and traditions of her people, Kate knew it was worth trying. After all, Ayanna had already proven that it was possible to live in two worlds. Perhaps it was time to teach adults what an 8-year-old girl had already understood. 6 months had passed since the preliminary agreement, and Ayanna celebrated her 9th birthday in a party that perfectly summarized the new reality they had created. During the day, Kate prepared a corn cake with honey, a recipe her Mexican mother had taught her. In the afternoon, Victorio organized an Apache ceremony where Ayanna received a new name, Bridge Between Worlds. The mining partnership had begun hesitantly but successfully. 3 silver veins were discovered using traditional Apache knowledge about the mountains, resulting in substantial profits for both sides. Victorio had become a respected figure among the more sensible miners, who recognized the practical value of his expertise. But not everything was celebration. The arrival of more settlers had swelled Mesilla to almost 500 inhabitants, and many of the newcomers had no interest whatsoever in the delicate agreements that had been established. They wanted cheap land and even cheaper labor, and saw the Apache presence as an obstacle to both objectives. Mrs. Thornton had become leader of a group that called itself the Committee for Progress and Security, which regularly petitioned territorial authorities for complete removal of Apaches. Samuel Porter, for his part, had discovered that selling whiskey to miners was much more lucrative than selling to local farmers, and supported anything that maintained the flow of hard men with money in their pockets. For Kate, the period was one of intense personal growth. Ayanna, now fluent in 3 languages, had become her constant companion and her link to a community she had never imagined joining. The girl translated not just words but concepts, helping Kate understand Apache worldviews that were profoundly different from her own. "Papa likes you," Ayanna said one May afternoon while helping Kate plant beans in the garden. A lot. Kate felt heat rise to her cheeks. What had begun as mutual respect between her and Victorio had evolved into something deeper and more complicated. Conversations extended late into the night. They shared meals regularly, and Kate had begun to notice how his eyes lit up when she arrived at camp. "And you like my father," Ayanna continued with the brutal frankness of children. Kate couldn't deny it. Victoria was different from Eduardo in almost every aspect. Where her husband had been gentle and domestic, Victoria was intense and connected to natural forces that Kate was just beginning to understand. But there was integrity in both men, a capacity to love deeply that touched something fundamental in her nature. "It's complicated, little one," Kate said. "Why?" Ayana asked, genuinely confused. "You make each other happy." That childish simplicity contrasted dramatically with the complexity Kate faced. A relationship with Victoria would mean not only challenging social conventions, but potentially putting at risk the entire fragile agreement they had built. Tensions came to the surface at a community meeting in July. Mrs. Thornton had organized a gathering to discuss Messiah's future, which quickly turned into a session of complaints against Apache presence. "It's not natural," she declared, looking directly at Kate. "American women living like savages." "Mrs. Thornton," Kate responded with controlled calm, "I don't live like a savage. I live as a Christian, caring for a child and seeking peace." "Peace?" Samuel Porter scoffed. "They're getting rich off our silver." "Our silver?" Don Carlos replied, who had become Kate's firm ally. "This land was theirs before it was ours." The discussion intensified rapidly. There were shouts, accusations, and for a moment, Kate feared they would come to blows. It was when Father Matthew stood up. "Enough," he said with a voice that echoed through the improvised meeting hall. "We're talking about a child, about a family, about people who have lived in peace with us and contributed to our prosperity." "Father," Mrs. Thornton said with an icy voice, "you have allowed pagan influences to corrupt your flock." "Madam," Matthews responded firmly, "Jesus Christ said we should love our neighbor as ourselves. He added no exceptions based on skin color or cultural origin." Kate left the meeting knowing that tensions were reaching a breaking point. There were people on both sides who weren't willing to accept the compromise that she, Victorio, and others had worked to build. That night, while Ayana slept, Kate and Victorio walked through the garden under starlight. "Maybe it's time for you to choose," he said softly. "What do you mean?" "Between our world and yours," Victorio said. "You can't live between the two forever. It's, how do you say, dangerous." Kate understood that he was offering her a way out, a chance to return to the safety of her previous life, before meeting Ayana, before falling in love with a man who represented everything her society rejected. "What if I don't want to choose?" she asked. Victorio stopped and faced her, his eyes reflecting moonlight. "Then we'll fight together." It was at that moment that Kate knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just a second love, but a partner who was willing to face the world at her side. But first, they would have to survive the storms that were approaching. The news arrived on an August morning through an official telegram that Captain Wheeler delivered personally. Kate read the official words with growing horror. All Apaches in the region would be transferred to the Bosque Redondo Reservation within 3 months. Bosque Redondo was notorious throughout the territory, an arid and desolate land in New Mexico where various tribes had been forced to live in deplorable conditions. It was less a reservation and more an open-air prison where indigenous traditions died slowly while diseases and malnutrition claimed lives. "It's not negotiable," Wheeler said, clearly uncomfortable with the message he carried. Direct order from Washington. Victorio was present when the news arrived. Kate saw something break in his eyes when Wheeler explained the details of the forced relocation. "Major Coleman promised," Victorio said, his voice controlled but laden with cold anger. "Coleman was transferred," Wheeler explained. "New commanders, new policy." Kate felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. In 3 months, she would lose Ayana and Victorio to an exile that would probably mean slow death for many of them. "Are there exceptions?" Kate asked. "Children can be placed in missionary schools," Wheeler said. "It would be better for her." "No," Victorio said immediately. "My daughter stays with me." When Wheeler left, Kate and Victorio sat on the porch in heavy silence. Ayana played in the yard, still not knowing that her world was about to be shattered again. "Isn't there a way to fight this?" Kate asked. "I can fight," Victorio said grimly, "but it will be war, death, and in the end, the same result." Kate thought of everything they had built: the mining agreement, peaceful coexistence, the small community where an Apache girl could attend Methodist school and still learn traditions of her people. Everything would be destroyed by Washington's insensitive bureaucracy. It was then that she remembered something Don Carlos had mentioned weeks before. His sister had married a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man who had represented Mexican farmers in land disputes against the American government. "What if we fought legally?" Kate suggested. Victorio looked at her without understanding. "What? With papers, with laws. There are lawyers who know American laws better than soldiers." In the following days, Kate and Don Carlos sent urgent letters to Santa Fe. The response came a week later. James Morrison, Don Carlos's brother-in-law, was willing to examine the case. Morrison was a tall and elegant man, with carefully trimmed beard and eyes that missed little. He arrived in a dusty wagon and went straight to the point. "The case is difficult," he said after examining all documents related to the mining agreement, "but not impossible. The problem is that you need to prove that relocation would violate existing treaties and harm American economic interests." "How?" Kate asked. "The mining agreement," Morrison explained. "If we can demonstrate that Apache relocation will cost more in lost production than it would cost to keep them here, we have an argument." It was a cynical strategy, appealing to greed instead of humanity, but it was also realistic. Morrison knew Washington's politicians and bureaucrats. "How much time do we have?" Victorio asked. 2 months to prepare a convincing case," Morrison said, "and I'm going to need detailed numbers on silver production, profits, and future projections." Kate threw herself into work with energy fueled by desperation. She gathered production data, organized testimonies from miners who depended on Apache expertise, and even got a letter of support from Major Coleman, now stationed in Colorado. Ayanna, sensing that something important was happening, helped in whatever way she could. She translated conversations between Kate and some of the older miners who trusted Victorio more than the new administrators. "Kate is fighting for us," Victorio explained to his daughter one night. "Kate always fights for family," Ayanna responded with the simple wisdom that frequently surprised adults. The weeks passed quickly. Morrison made 2 trips to Washington, sent dozens of telegrams, and mobilized political contacts that Kate didn't even know existed. With 2 weeks remaining before the relocation deadline, the response arrived. They had achieved a 6-month extension and permission to argue the case before a territorial commission. It wasn't victory yet, but it was hope. And for the first time in weeks, Kate saw Victorio smile when he looked at Ayanna playing in the yard she had come to consider home. 2 years had passed since the first relocation threat, and the world had changed in ways Kate never could have imagined. The legal argument had been successful, partially. The government had agreed to establish a small local reservation on lands less valuable for mining, but which included some of the most important sacred areas for Victorio's people. The victory had been costly. Kate had spent almost all her savings on legal costs, and the farm needed repairs she couldn't afford. But there were compensations that no money could buy. Ayanna, now 11 years old, had become a bilingual and bicultural young woman who navigated between worlds with natural grace. She attended Father Matthews's school in the mornings and learned Apache traditions with her father and elders in the afternoons. More importantly, she had become the living bridge between the two communities, translating not just words but concepts and feelings. The mining partnership had prospered beyond the most optimistic expectations. Apache expertise had led to the discovery of 3 new silver veins, and the mutual respect developed between miners and Apaches had created a stability that benefited everyone. But the most significant change was personal. Kate and Victorio had married in a ceremony that combined Irish, Mexican, and Apache traditions in a way that had never been attempted in the region. Father Matthews had officiated the Christian part of the ceremony, invoking blessings in English and Spanish. The elder from Victorio's people had conducted traditional Apache rites, including sharing sacred water from nearby mountains, and Don Carlos had contributed with a Mexican celebration that included music, dance, and enough food to feed half of Mesilla. Mrs. Thornton had refused to participate, of course, but surprisingly many American settlers had attended. Dr. Hayes had given a toast to the courage to follow one's heart even when society disapproves. Even some of the hardest miners had set aside their reservations to celebrate a union that had brought prosperity to the region. Kate's house had transformed into something unique, a home where Irish artifacts from her family mixed with Mexican pottery and Apache crafts. The garden flourished with medicinal plants that Victorio had brought from the mountains, mixed with the rose bushes that Eduardo had planted years before. "It's like a little world of its own," Father Matthews commented during a visit, watching Ayanna teach Apache words to an American child who had come to play. Kate agreed. They had created something rare, a family and community that functioned despite all the cultural differences that should have made any harmony impossible. But not everything was perfect. There were ongoing tensions with some settlers, constant pressure from territorial authorities, and always the threat that political changes in Washington could destroy everything they had built. Sometimes I wonder if we'll be able to maintain this, Kate confessed to Victoria one afternoon, while they watched Ayana and other children, Apache, Mexican and American, playing together in the yard. I don't know, Victoria responded honestly. The world is changing very fast, but now, today, we are happy. Maybe that's enough. Kate understood that he was right. They couldn't control the future, but they could value the present. They had love, they had family, they had a functioning community. They had built something beautiful amid difficult circumstances. That night, while putting Ayana to bed, the girl asked a question that surprised Kate. Kate, do you miss how it was before? Before you found me? Kate thought carefully before responding. I miss your father, Eduardo, she said. I always will, but I don't miss being alone. I don't miss not having you and your father, Victorio, in my life. Good, Ayana said with satisfaction, because now we are a real family, chosen family. Chosen family. Kate carried those words with her as she prepared for sleep. That was exactly what they had created. Not a family united only by blood or tradition, but by conscious choice to love and care for each other, despite all differences and difficulties. When Victorio arrived late from camp, he found Kate on the porch watching the stars. What are you thinking about? He asked, sitting beside her. About how we got here, she replied. About how a sandstorm brought a lost girl who changed everything. It wasn't a storm, Victorio said softly. It was destiny. Kate looked at the man beside her, strong, gentle, complex, and toward the house where a girl she loved as a daughter slept safely. Maybe Victorio was right. Maybe some things really were destiny. And if it was destiny, then maybe they had a real chance of keeping this extraordinary family together, despite all the forces trying to separate them. For now it was enough to be here, under Arizona's stars, with love and hope to sustain whatever challenges were yet to come. The problem arrived with the elegant and disturbing figure of Thomas Brennan, a territorial politician who stepped down from his carriage on an October morning like an omen dressed in black linen. His small, calculating eyes examined Messia like a merchant evaluating merchandise, and Kate felt a chill when he fixed his gaze in the direction of her farm. Brennan was different from the rough soldiers who had dealt with the situation previously. He was a man driven by pure political ambition who saw any deviation from official policy as a personal threat to his own advancement. He had arrived from Phoenix with a retinue of advisors and immediately called a public meeting to clarify certain flagrant irregularities. Kate was in the yard gathering the last pumpkins of the year when Ayana ran home from school, her bare feet raising small clouds of golden dust. The girl's face was flushed with worry, her dark eyes shining with an anxiety Kate hadn't seen in months. Kate, she said, alternating between Portuguese and Spanish as she always did when agitated, there's a man in town saying bad things about Papa, about all of us. Kate dropped the basket of pumpkins and knelt to be at Ayana's height, noticing how the girl's small hands trembled slightly. What kind of things, little one? He says we're illegal, that Papa should be on a reservation, that you're helping criminals. The words poured out in a torrent as if Ayana wanted to get rid of them quickly. Kate's heart accelerated, but she kept her voice calm. They had enjoyed 2 relatively peaceful years, but she had always known that this peace was fragile as crystal, depending on the goodwill of distant politicians who could change their minds as easily as they changed their ties. Where is your father now? Kate asked, running her hands through Ayana's dark hair in a comforting gesture. Meeting with the elders, Ayana replied. They're worried too. Kate made a quick decision, feeling the familiar Irish determination awaken in her chest. Go get your father. Tell him to come here. We're going to face this together. The public meeting was held in Samuel Porter's expanded tavern, now large enough to accommodate Messia's growing population. Kate arrived with Victorio and Ayana, a visual declaration of unity that made murmurs run through the crowd like waves on still water. Brennan was a small and meticulous man, with waxed mustache and a suit that contrasted brutally with the practical clothing of the frontier. When he saw Victorio, his eyes narrowed with poorly disguised disdain, as if he were observing something unpleasant. Ladies and gentlemen, Brennan began with a strident voice, I was sent here to evaluate compliance with federal policies regarding indigenous populations. What I found is disturbing. Kate felt Ayana shrink slightly beside her and placed a protective hand on the girl's shoulder, transmitting strength through touch. It appears that, Brennan continued, certain elements of this community have chosen to ignore federal mandates regarding Apache relocation. Furthermore, there is evidence of irregular arrangements that violate established laws. "What law?" asked Don Carlos, rising from his chair near the back of the room, his voice laden with offended dignity. "The law that requires all hostile indigenous populations to be relocated to designated reservations," Brennan replied with growing irritation. "The law that prohibits civilians from entering into agreements with said populations without federal oversight." "Doctor," Hayes also stood up, his grey beard trembling with indignation. "Mr. Brennan, these people have lived in peace here for 2 years. They have contributed significantly to local prosperity. Where is the harm?" "The harm," Brennan said, his voice rising like a fanatic preacher, "is in the precedent. If we allow these irregularities here, what prevents similar situations from developing in other territories? Federal policy exists for good reasons." Kate felt the tension in the air thickening like honey in winter. She could see familiar faces, some supporters, others hostile, many simply uncertain about what this political posturing meant for their own lives. It was then that Father Matthews stood up, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Brennan," he said with quiet authority, "as a man of faith I must ask, what exactly is being proposed here?" "What is being proposed," Brennan replied with smugness that made Kate feel nauseous, "is immediate compliance with federal law. The Apache known as Victorio and his band must be relocated to Bosque Redondo within 30 days. The child must be placed in an appropriate missionary school. And all irregular agreements must be terminated immediately." A murmur of shock ran through the crowd, like wind across a wheat field. Kate felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. After 2 years of careful work, legal victories and community building, they were back at square one. "What about the mining agreements?" asked one of the miners, his voice rough with concern. "We've been profitable specifically because of Apache expertise." "New arrangements can be made with approved contractors," Brennan said dismissively, as if he were talking about replacing broken tools. "The government will ensure that production is not significantly affected." Kate knew this was complete nonsense. No outside contractor knew the mountains like Victorio's people knew them. The profitable mining operation they had built would collapse within months. Victorio, who had remained silent during most of the meeting, finally spoke. His voice was low but carried clearly through the room. "We made agreement," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen. "Legal paper. Why not good now?" "Because," Brennan said with poorly contained disdain, "treaties and agreements made by local officials do not supersede federal policy when that policy changes." It was at that moment that Kate realized they were facing not just bureaucratic obstinacy, but something more sinister. Brennan wasn't just enforcing policy, he was deliberately destroying something that worked because it didn't fit his narrow vision of how things should be. "What if we refuse?" Kate asked, standing up with quiet dignity. Brennan looked at her with something approaching amusement. "Mrs. Morales, if you refuse to comply, you will be charged with aiding and abetting federal fugitives. Your property may be confiscated, and you may face imprisonment." The threat was clear and real. Kate felt Ayana's small hand slip into hers, small fingers trembling slightly. But she also felt something else, a familiar Irish stubbornness that her father had passed down to her, combined with fierce maternal protectiveness that made the idea of separating from Ayana unbearable. "Then I guess," Kate said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "you'll have to arrest me too." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of wind in the tavern's loose boards and the beating of her own heart. The silence in the tavern stretched like an eternity, suspended in the thick air of tobacco and tension. Kate felt the weight of all eyes upon her, but maintained her erect posture like a pine against storm, her hand firmly intertwined with Ayana's. Victorio stepped forward to stand beside her, a silent demonstration of unity that made Brennan frown with growing irritation. "Mrs. Morales," Brennan said with a voice cold as morning frost, "do you understand the implications of what you just said?" "I understand perfectly," Kate replied, her voice carrying echoes of her Mexican mother's strength and her Irish father's determination. "I understand that you're proposing to destroy a family and community that work. I understand that you're willing to use the law as a weapon against innocent people. And I understand that I cannot remain silent while this happens." It was then that something happened that no one had anticipated. Ayana released Kate's hand and walked toward the center of the room, each step deliberate like an Apache dancer performing sacred ritual. The 11-year-old girl, small even for her age, stopped directly in front of Brennan and faced him with a composure that impressed even her enemies. The simple cotton dress that Kate had sewn for her contrasted with the artificial elegance of Brennan's suit, but there was a natural dignity in the girl's posture that made all his political formality seem hollow and pretentious. "Sir," she said in clear Portuguese with only a slight accent that spoke of her multicultural heritage, "may I ask a question?" Brennan, clearly uncomfortable with direct confrontation from a child, hesitated like a man caught between proprieties. "I suppose so. What will happen to me if my father is sent to Bosque Redondo and Kate is arrested?" The question was simple, direct, and cut through all political rhetoric like a knife through warm butter, reaching straight to the human heart of the situation. Brennan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly not having expected to be challenged in this way by a child. "You would be placed in an appropriate school," he finally said, but his voice had lost part of its previous authority, like wind losing strength. "A school where I can't see my father, where I can't speak Apache, where I can't visit Kate?" Ayanna asked, her voice small but steady like a stream flowing over stones. "You would be properly educated," Brennan said, but was clearly uncomfortable, shifting weight from one foot to the other. "Educated to forget who I am," Ayanna said with startling maturity that made several adults in the room wince. "Educated to be ashamed of my people." It was Dr. Hayes who broke the silence that followed, heavy as storm clouds. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "look at this child. She speaks 3 languages fluently. She knows both traditional Apache medicinal plants and modern medicine. She can navigate between cultures with grace that most adults never achieve. In what possible way would an appropriate education be better than this?" Father Matthews joined in, his voice carrying moral authority that years of ministry had built. "This girl is living proof that integration and respect for cultural differences can work. She is a miracle of human adaptability and love." "Gentlemen," Brennan said, but his voice now carried less conviction, like echo in an empty canyon. "Sentimental considerations cannot override federal policy." It was then that Ayanna did something no one expected. She reached into a small pouch she always carried, a gift from her biological mother, and pulled out a piece of paper, carefully folded like precious treasure. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "did you read all the documents about our situation?" Brennan looked confused, like a man asked about documents that shouldn't exist. "I reviewed all relevant documents, including this one." Ayanna handed him the paper with precise, ritualized movements. Brennan unfolded it, and his expression changed dramatically, as if he had seen a ghost. Kate couldn't see what was written, but could see the impact it had on the politician, draining color from his face. "Where did you get this?" Brennan asked, his voice suddenly much quieter, almost whispered. "It's a copy," Ayanna said simply, with the dignity of someone much older. "Lawyer Morrison gave it to my father last year. The original is in Washington." Kate looked at Victorio questioningly, but he seemed as confused as she was, his dark eyes reflecting the same bewilderment. Dr. Hayes moved closer to look at the paper over Brennan's shoulder. "What is this?" Brennan looked up from the document, his face pale as morning frost. "These are formal adoption papers." The room exploded in confused murmurs that rose and fell like waves. Kate felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as if reality itself had tilted. "Adoption papers?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna turned to face her, eyes bright with something that might have been mischief mixed with deep love. "Kate, do you remember when Lawyer Morrison came last year, and he asked you many questions about wanting me to be officially your daughter?" Kate did remember. Morrison had asked hypothetical questions about adoption, but she had assumed he was just exploring legal options that would never be necessary, like drawing maps of territory that would never be visited. He filled out the papers," Ayanna said proudly, like a child announcing a successful surprise. "With my father's consent, and because you are a widow with good character, and because I've been living here for more than a year. It's legal now." Brennan was staring at the document as if it were a poisonous snake. "If these papers are valid." "They are valid," said a voice from the tavern door, cutting through the air like a blade. Everyone turned to see Morrison himself, apparently having arrived in Mesilla without anyone noticing, like a guardian angel appearing at the moment of greatest need. The room was absolutely silent now, as if everyone had stopped breathing simultaneously. Morrison walked to the center of the room with measured steps of a man accustomed to courtrooms and high stakes. "Mr. Brennan, you may have authority to relocate isolated Apache bands, but you do not have authority to break up legally constituted American families. Ayanna Morales," he emphasized the name, is the legally adopted daughter of Catherine Morales, American citizen. Any attempt to separate them would be a federal crime. Kate felt as if she could barely breathe, as if the air itself had become too thick. Ayanna was officially her daughter. When had this happened? How had she not known? Ayanna must have seen confusion in her face, because she walked back to Kate and took her hand, small fingers intertwining with larger ones. "Kate," she said softly, voice laden with love and wisdom beyond her years. "You always said I was your daughter in your heart. I wanted it to be true on paper too, so nobody could ever take me away from you." The emotional impact of this revelation hit Kate like a wave of warm ocean water. This child, this remarkable, brave, loving child, had found a way to protect their family through legal channels that even she hadn't known existed. Victorio spoke then, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "My daughter," he said, looking at Ayanna with pride that could light stars, "is wiser than her father." Brennan was clearly struggling to regain control of the situation that had slipped through his fingers like sand. Even if the adoption papers are valid," he said, "this doesn't change the status of the rest of the Apache band." "Actually," Morrison said smoothly, like a lawyer who had been preparing for exactly this moment, "it does change some things, because Ayanna is now legally considered part of the local community, and because mining agreements were made partially through her as cultural liaison. Terminating those agreements would be breach of contract that could result in significant financial penalties." Kate could see that Brennan was recognizing that his simple plan to clean up an irregular situation had become a legal nightmare that could destroy his career. More importantly, she could see in faces throughout the room that popular support for his policies was evaporating like morning dew. A little girl had outmaneuvered a federal bureaucrat through a combination of courage, intelligence, and love purer than mountain stream. And Kate realized that, legal papers aside, this had been true all along. Ayanna had always been her daughter in every way that mattered. In love, in care, in fierce protection, in daily acts of family life. Now it was true in every way possible, blessed by law and sealed with hope for a future where love could triumph over bureaucracy and families could be formed by choice rather than just blood. As tears rolled down her cheeks, Kate knew that whatever challenges still awaited them, they would face them as a family, complete, legal, and unshakable. 2 years had passed since that transformative day in the tavern, and Kate woke before sunrise on a golden April morning. The air was fresh and laden with the aroma of wildflowers that had returned after the first significant rains in 6 years. The drought had finally broken like a breaking fever, and the entire region bloomed as if all the earth was celebrating renewal. Ayanna slept peacefully in her room, officially and legally her room now, with documents confirming that she was Ayanna Morales, daughter of Catherine Morales. But more important than papers was the peace that Kate saw in the girl's face as she slept, a serenity that spoke of true belonging and secure love. Victorio had awakened early too, and was on the porch watching the sunrise over the sacred mountains. They had developed this routine in the months since Brennan's departure, quiet morning moments together before the day's activities began, like a private ritual of gratitude and connection. "Good morning, my love," Victorio said softly when Kate joined him, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. His Portuguese had improved dramatically in recent years, but he still preferred Spanish for intimate moments, and Kate had learned to treasure these small intimacies. They stood together watching as light gradually painted the landscape in shades of gold and copper. Kate never tired of this view, the mountains that held so much meaning for Victorio's people, the valley that had become home to their unlikely but beautiful family. "Thinking about anything specific?" Kate asked, noticing a particular thoughtfulness in his expression. "About changes," Victorio said. "About how much is different now." He was right. Changes had rippled through the entire region in ways that none of them could have predicted. Brennan had left Mesilla with his authority severely undermined and his political ambitions damaged beyond repair. More importantly, news of how a small community had successfully resisted heavy-handed federal intervention had spread to other territories, inspiring similar efforts at cooperation between different cultures. The mining partnership had not only continued, but had expanded beyond their most optimistic dreams. 3 more Apache bands from neighboring areas had approached about similar arrangements, and the territorial government had begun using Mesilla as a model for what could be achieved through peaceful cooperation instead of forced relocation and conflict. Mrs. Thornton had left Mesilla with her husband, supposedly to pursue business opportunities in Phoenix, but Kate suspected they simply couldn't adapt to a community where their prejudices weren't shared by the majority. Samuel Porter, surprisingly, had adapted quite well. He had discovered that Apache customers paid their bills promptly and never caused trouble in his tavern. Dr. Hayes had begun learning Apache medicine from Victoria's healers and sharing modern medical techniques with them. The result was a unique blend of healing practices that was drawing attention from medical practitioners as far away as Denver and Santa Fe. Father Matthews had become somewhat of a minor celebrity in Methodist circles for his innovative approaches to ministry in multicultural communities. He had been invited to speak at conferences about practical Christianity in frontier situations, spreading word about what faith could accomplish when combined with open hearts and minds. But the most significant changes were closer to home, woven into the daily fabric of their lives. Ayanna had blossomed into a remarkable young woman. At 13 now, she served as unofficial cultural ambassador between various communities, helping new settlers understand Apache perspectives and helping Apache families navigate American legal systems. Her unique position as Kate's legally adopted daughter had given her a platform that she used with wisdom far beyond her years. Kate herself had discovered strengths and capabilities she never knew existed within her. Managing complex legal documents, negotiating with federal bureaucrats, organizing community meetings, mediating disputes, these were skills that her quiet life as Eduardo's wife had never required. But they were skills that her new life had demanded, and she had risen to meet those demands like a plant reaching toward sunlight. And Victorio had evolved from feared hostile into respected community leader. His intelligence and natural dignity had won over many who initially regarded him with suspicion. He was consulted regularly on matters ranging from water rights to mining safety to weather patterns. His counsel was sought and valued. "I think," Kate said slowly, "we've built something really special here." "Yes," Victorio agreed, "but it will always be fragile. Next politician, next change in Washington could destroy everything again." Kate knew he was right. Their success had been built through a combination of luck, courage, timing, and people of goodwill that might not be repeatable if circumstances changed dramatically. Political winds could shift like weather patterns. "Then we enjoy it while we have it," Kate said, leaning into his warmth. "And we teach Ayanna to be strong enough to rebuild if necessary." They heard sounds from inside, Ayanna beginning to stir, preparing for another day at the school that had become a model for integrated education, where children from different backgrounds learned together and from each other. "She's strong enough," Victorio said with pride that could light the entire valley. "Stronger than both of us." Kate thought about what Ayanna had accomplished, mediating between cultures, mastering multiple languages, navigating complex legal situations, standing up to powerful men like Brennan. At 13, their daughter had already demonstrated more courage and wisdom than many adults ever achieved in lifetimes of experience. "We should wake her soon," Kate said. "Today is the community meeting about expanding mining partnerships." "5 more minutes," Victorio said, pulling Kate closer. 5 minutes of peace before the day gets complicated." Kate leaned into his warmth and thought about how far they had all traveled from that morning when she first found a small Apache girl hiding in her garden during a sandstorm. So much pain, so much struggle, but also so much growth and discovery and love. They had created not just a family, but a model for how different peoples could live together with mutual respect and shared prosperity. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't guaranteed to last forever, but it was beautiful, like sunrise over mountains, real like earth beneath their feet. "Kate," came Ayanna's sleepy voice from inside the house. "Coming, my daughter," Kate called out, using words that now carried legal weight as well as emotional truth. As they walked toward the house together, Kate realized that somewhere along the journey, she had stopped thinking in terms of mine and theirs and us versus them. There was just family now, just community, just people who cared about each other enough to build something better than what they had inherited from past generations of conflict and misunderstanding. The sunrise painted everything in gold. The mountains, the garden where Eduardo's roses still bloomed alongside Apache medicinal plants, the faces of people she loved more than life itself. Through a window, Kate could see Ayanna stretching and beginning her day, this remarkable young woman who had taught them all that families could be formed through choice and love rather than just blood and tradition. that different cultures could blend like colors in a beautiful painting rather than clash like armies on a battlefield. It was, Kate thought, a perfect way to begin another day in their imperfect, beautiful, hard-won world where love had triumphed over fear, where understanding had conquered prejudice, where an Irish-Mexican widow, an Apache chief, and a brave little girl had proven that miracles were possible when people chose compassion over convenience.